Good morning. I'm Chad Stebbins. Thank you for coming to this Japan semester presentation. Great turnout today. Thank you for the faculty who are here, as well as the students. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. David Harris is an upper school history teacher at Thomas Jefferson Independent Day School in Joplin, which is just practically across from Missouri Southern on Newman Road. He's going to be speaking today, Black Ships to Little Boy, a history of American-Japanese relations from 1853 to 1945. David received his master's degree from the University of Central Arkansas in 2018, studying global history with a focus on modern Japan and Korea. His research interests include imperial formations, world systems analysis, and diplomatic history. His work on the 1910-1911 American-Japanese War scare has been nationally recognized and was featured in the 2020 Association of Asian Studies annual conference. David is from Louisiana originally. He has a wife, 2 dogs, and 1 cat, and enjoys gardening. Please join with me in welcoming David Harris.
All right, is this on? Can you all hear me? Cool. Just wave at me if I'm yelling or talking too quietly at some point. I'm not used to lecturing with a mic, so this will be a new experience for all of us in some regard. All right. Without further ado. 9 a.m., September 2nd, 1945. The brutal Pacific War between the United States and Japan would come to a conclusion this morning aboard the American Iowa-class battleship USS Missouri. In a carefully choreographed ceremony, the Japanese representatives signed the Articles of Surrender while representatives from all the Allied nations looked on. Behind the rows of Allied officers and dignitaries hung a framed American flag, one of the many that bedecked the American ships this morning in Tokyo Bay, but this one was special. With 30 stars, this was not the current U.S. naval ensign, but one that had been flown in the same inlet, then known as Edo Bay, aboard the USS Powhatan 92 years earlier. The Powhatan had been the flagship of Commodore Matthew Perry's expedition to Japan in 1853, a voyage like that of the Missouri that had also ended in the signing of a treaty under threat of force. The presence of the flag that morning sent a message that was not too difficult to discern for any of those present that morning, American or Japanese. We meet a threat, you did not take it seriously enough, and now look at what has become of you. The smoldering ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki both served as testaments to the American willingness to follow through on Perry's threat made in 1853. The Pacific War, in many regards, marked the final culmination of nearly a century of escalating diplomatic tensions between the 2 empires for influence in the Pacific. My talk today will examine the history of the diplomatic relationship between the United States and Japan between the arrival of Perry's black ships in 1853 and the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. This will be a story primarily told from the Japanese perspective looking east, as the rapidly industrializing state sought to navigate the challenges that it faced. It would be erroneous to try and find a single turning point in the American-Japanese relationship, one moment from which the die was cast and conflict in the Pacific Ocean became inevitable. Indeed, so little in history ever is inevitable. However, what I do hope to do is show that the coming of war in the Pacific had deep roots that extended far beyond the rise of Japanese militarism in the 1930s and the global Great Depression. Moreover, I will argue that if there can be said to be any key period of divergence in an otherwise nominally warm relationship between the United States and Japan, it came between 1905 and 1920, between the end of the Russo-Japanese War and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in the aftermath of the First World War, as the 2 countries saw their interests begin to diverge and set them on a path towards conflict. As a final note, Over the course of this talk, while I'm attempting to tell this story from the perspective of the Japanese looking east, I will inevitably often be quite sympathetic to the Japanese position in its diplomatic disputes with the United States in the lead up to the Second World War. Like a host of other historians, my work attempts to recontextualize Japanese aggression within the broader framework of late 19th century and early 20th century imperialism. To put it bluntly, the Japanese were hardly the first to try and carve up spheres of influence in East Asia. However, this examination should not be understood as support for Japanese actions in the period 1931 to 1945. From the rape of Nanjing to the actions of Unit 731, these war crimes deserve to be called out as such, and sympathy for the Japanese position in the lead up to the war does not mean their justification. You may recall learning in high school that the Japanese completely closed their country off from the outside world in the late 17th century. Beginning in 1633, the Tokugawa shogunate had adopted the policy of Sankoku in the aftermath of Ieyasu's victory and the unification of the islands under his rule. The principal objectives of Sankoku, or closed country, were twofold. First and foremost, to suppress the spread of Christianity, a religion that had spread rapidly through Japan and the Tokugawas feared would further destabilize it. And second, to limit the ability of the outlying daimyo to raise wealth through trade and plot against the shogun, to plot with foreigners. However, in contrast to what you may have been taught, the reality is that Sankoku didn't so much close Japan off to the outside world as it sought to just limit contact with European states. Trade with China continued as important to the functioning of the Japanese economy as ever. And indeed, trade with the Ryukyu kingdoms, the Ainu of Hokkaido, and Korea continued apace throughout the entire period of Sengoku. Even Europeans were not entirely closed off, with the Dutch notably enjoying access to Japanese trade through the island of Dejima in Nagasaki Bay. And through this trade, European innovations would continue to flow into the country. This period of Sengoku encompasses what we call in Japanese history the Edo Period, one of the high points of Japanese culture lasting from 1603 to 1868. And after the chaos of Sengoku Jidai, the era of warring daimyo, of warring states that had preceded the establishment of the shogunate, the Edo period, in contrast, was one of sustained peace and economic prosperity. Literacy rates rose rapidly all around the country as Japan underwent a cultural and artistic renaissance. However, by the Edo period's third century, trouble loomed on the horizon. Europe's Industrial Revolution had allowed its states to make a quantum leap ahead of much of the rest of the world. And the result of this emerging great divergence was to leave the states of Eurasia's historic economic core, China, India, Japan, East Asia, technologically lagging. And nowhere was this emerging gap more apparent than in the First Opium War, fought between the British Empire and the Chinese Qing dynasty from 1839 to 1841. The war had seen the Chinese defeated and forced to accept a humiliating peace treaty, which had increasingly opened up their country to European trade and extraterritorial privileges for European nationals. And while the Tokugawa shogunate took note of these events to their west, by this point, rather decadent shogunate did very little to prepare Japan for what seemed increasingly inevitable. And so it was that the Japanese were more or less completely unprepared for the sudden arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry on July 7th, 1853, at the mouth of Edo Bay. The American Commodore had been dispatched by then-President Millard Fillmore to open up the country to American trade, by force if necessary, and to establish an American embassy. The Japanese, for their part, were especially awed by Perry's steamships, like the USS Powhatan, the so-called Kurofune, or black ships. And the fear they inspired in the Japanese is neatly captured in a famous Japanese poem from 1853, and you all will have to forgive me for my abysmal pronunciation, but I'm going to attempt it anyway. Taihen no nemori o samusu Yokisen tatashihai de yormo nemurezu. A complex set of puns, the poem literally translates to discussing tea, saying nothing of Perry's actual arrival in the horror. However, it's built on words with double meanings, and a more accurate translation conveying kind of this fear in the face of Perry's arrival in the black ships would be the following. The steam-powered ships break the halcyon slumber of the Pacific. A mere 4 boats are enough to make us lose sleep at night. After prevaricating, attempting to put off Perry, and fearing a similar fate to the Qing dynasty, the shogunate signed the Convention of Kanagawa with Perry, agreeing to basically all the American demands. And this would be the first of numerous agreements that the Japanese were to sign with Western countries in the years to come, known domestically and collectively as unequal treaties, or Ansei treaties. To avoid the semi-colonial fate of China, Japan had agreed, among other things, to waive tariff rights to various Western powers, and to grant European and American citizens extraterritorial privileges within Japan itself. Many of the Japanese viewed the loss of sovereignty as a humiliation, and anger mounted against the fading shogunate that had agreed to them in the first place. This anger would culminate 15 years after Perry's arrival in the Boshin War, a revolution that pitted outlying provinces like Satsuma and Shoshu against the shogunate itself. The revolutionaries were successful in toppling the by then ancient shogunate and established a new government under the then 16-year-old Emperor Meiji, signaling the Meiji Restoration, the beginning of the direct rule of the Japanese emperors. Whereas the shogunate had been attempting to, as near as possible, to preserve the status quo in Japan, to avoid as much disruption as possible. During the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese government began centralizing authority and industrializing in its attempts to turn Japan into a modern nation state. And these changes would come at lightning speed. As in a mere 20 years, Japan was transformed from a quasi-feudal state to a developing industrial powerhouse. At this point, and it might surprise you, but despite the role of Perry in opening up Japan, the United States and Japan enjoyed relatively rosy relations, with the Japanese making use of American investment and technical expertise to jumpstart their industrialization. Many of these so-called unequal treaties were up for renegotiation around 1900, around the turn of the 20th century. And the objective of the Meiji government in the years following the Restoration, more unstated than explicit, was to ensure that Japan would be able to renegotiate them from a position of strength on the international stage. To that end, it's sometimes argued by historians that Japan's rapid industrialization was arguably akin to self-colonization, to avoid colonization by Western powers as the country leapt suddenly and at points traumatically into the modern world. So as many of you are no doubt aware, the late 19th centuries and the early 20th centuries were the era of Euro-American so-called new imperialism, as Western countries came to dominate approximately 90% of the surface area of the world, carving up every last corner of Africa and Southeast Asia and extending their imperial domination. Now, the economic and ideological motivations for this renewed era of imperialism were complex, to say the least. But one idea that loomed large on the ideological end of the spectrum was that of social Darwinism, popularized in the late 19th century in the aftermath of Darwin's On the Origin of Species. And social Darwinism essentially held that human races were in competition with each other, and to some extent, these clashes of civilization between states were the playing out of Darwin's principles of natural selection in human societies. This is to say that while economic motivations were extremely important in the acquisition of these new empires, Many colonies would be taken for ideological reasons stemming from this, to build national prestige, to project the image of a thriving nation state, a fit nation state and empire. To put a fine point on it, in Germany, for example, in its acquisition of colonies in Africa, did not acquire anything relatively worthwhile, but it was to rally national sentiment at home and show that the newly unified German state in 1871 was a force to be reckoned with internationally. To that end, as modernization in Japan proceeded apace and the Meiji government saw East Asia and Southeast Asia increasingly being divided up by the Western powers, pressure grew to begin building a Japanese empire, to both deny these territories to potential European empires, to strengthen the Japanese economy, and to show that Europeans and Americans should not lump Japan into the same category as a state like late Qing dynasty China. And so it would be only 8 years after the Meiji Restoration and only 23 years after Japan was on the receiving end of gunboat diplomacy that the Japanese government would begin practicing it themselves. The Japanese in 1876 would forcibly open Korea and begin nearly a century-long effort to expand their influence into and eventually colonize their nearest neighbor on the Asian mainland. In 1895, the Japanese would continue the process of building a Japanese empire with the Sino-Japanese War, something of a hammer blow to the failing Qing dynasty that saw the Chinese end their suzerainty over Korea and cede the island of Taiwan to the Japanese. This is to say that Japan at this point had taken major strides towards proving its imperial mettle on the international stage. But with the power vacuum in Manchuria caused by the defeat of the Qing, they were about to face their sternest challenge yet. Because seeking to capitalize on the weakness of China, on the weakness of the Qing dynasty, was another imperial power, Tsarist Russia. Now, the Russians sought to create a sphere of influence in Manchuria and in Korea themselves, pursuing, by this point, a centuries-old Russian dream of having a warm water port, a port from which they could trade and was ice-free all year, as opposed to northern ports like Archangel. And indeed, negotiating with the Qing, they secured long-term access to Port Arthur in China. But this rattled the Japanese, to say the least. And despite negotiations between the two to attempt to work out their differences, their rival imperial ambitions in the Far East, negotiations would ultimately break down. Now, on February 9th, 1904, the Japanese would open hostilities with a surprise naval attack on the Russian fleet anchored in Port Arthur, kicking off the Russo-Japanese War. Now, in this conflict, Japan would stun observers by decisively defeating the Russians at every single turn, hamstrung as the Tsars were by trying to fight in a region that was joined to the Russian heartland by just a single railhead, the Trans-Siberian Railway. And indeed, Japan's victory in this war would mark the first time a non-European power would defeat a European power since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The war would precipitate a political crisis in Russia that nearly ended the reign of Tsar Nicholas II 12 years before the Russian Revolution. However, despite the unrest and defeats on both land and sea, the Russians proved stubbornly unwilling to give up, leading to both combatants seeking international arbitration to end the conflict. And this is where the United States finally enters the scene in a meaningful sense, because the chosen arbitrator was American President Theodore Roosevelt, one who the Japanese assumed would broker a peace deal that was favorable to them. And indeed, the Japanese populace at this point, who are very aware that they have had an unbroken string of victories this entire conflict, are anticipating something of a total victory. However, preferring an immediate settlement, Roosevelt felt compelled to prevent the Japanese from imposing a humiliating peace on Russia, He wanted to foster long-term peace in the region, even if that meant Japan would not get everything that the population expected. And so while Russia ceded and recognized Japanese predominance in Korea and Manchuria, the territorial concessions, notably on Sakhalin Island, that the Japanese public had come to expect, and more importantly, the monetary reparations that at this point were desperately needed to pay for what had been a very expensive war for the fledgling state, were not forthcoming. They did not make it into the final treaty. The Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in 1906, the Japanese felt they had little option but to sign. The war would mark a sea change moment in the international balance of power in East Asia. Japan had finally arrived as a great power. And the years to come, it would successfully renegotiate all the unequal treaties it had been subject to in the aftermath of the forcible opening of the country. However, the Japanese public expected total victory, and to them, the peace deal, regardless of what it signaled for Japan on the international stage, was a humiliation. And in the aftermath of the Treaty of Portsmouth, riots would rock major Japanese cities. The Taro cabinet would collapse, and a new government would have to be formed amid domestic unrest. For what it's worth, Roosevelt's going to win the Nobel Peace Prize for his brokering of this treaty between Russia and Japan. But the Japanese came away from this viewing the American arbitration as a slap in the face. And so with the Russians more or less removed from Manchuria and Korea, and now with an American presence in the Philippines in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, it seemed increasingly like to many Japanese observers that the Americans were the new imperial rival, and they had attempted to undermine the Japanese position in the Treaty of Portsmouth. And so dissatisfaction with the treaty's outcome would lead to increased tension between the country and the United States in the years following, culminating in a series of war scares, a period of heightened tension where war seemed all but inevitable. And indeed, the publics of both countries almost clamored for war with one another. The first would come in 1907, when the state of California began segregating Japanese immigrant children into schools for Chinese and Korean immigrants, whereas previously they had attended schools among white Americans. This discrimination against Japanese immigrants prompted the Japanese to begin formally protesting this racist policy and invoke talk of national honor, the need to defend the interests of their nationals. And so for months, talk on both sides of the Pacific turned to the possibility of war. It would eventually be averted with the so-called Gentleman's Agreement later that year. The Roosevelt administration, representing the federal government, interceded in the policies of the state of California and forced them to reintegrate the schools. The Japanese immigrant children would no longer have to go to school alongside their Korean and Chinese counterparts. But the Japanese government, in reply or in response, promised to limit Japanese immigration to the United States, to make it more difficult for immigrants to sail east. And even though this is a nominal settlement to this dispute, the Japanese chafed, noting that no such agreement of limiting immigration was in place for the British or the French or the Germans. So why are our immigrants treated any differently? Were we not equals on the world stage now in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War? To the Americans, apparently not. And so talk of war continued to loom in the Pacific throughout the 1900s and 1910s, as often as not more driven by influential individuals in both countries than by the governments. Individuals like William Randolph Hearst, who saw a potential conflict as being more about national honor and pride than territorial aspirations, writing about the potential conflict in the language of social Darwinism. This is not to say there were not economic motivations for the conflict as well. When the Japanese refused to allow American investment into Manchurian railroads in 1910, it led a host of American businessmen to cry foul. that the Japanese were acting counter to U.S. interests and counter to U.S. foreign policy in China. At the time, American foreign policy in China is called the open door. Essentially, the United States sought to keep China open to trade from all Western powers, basically. This was notably at odds with how a lot of other Western powers approached China, wanting to carve up individual spheres of influence within the kind of failing Qing dynasty. And indeed, the Japanese have more of this idea. They want to carve up a sphere of influence in Manchuria, which will be their economic zone. But prior to this, they had always very kind of carefully been like, we affirm the open door. We affirm the open door, even if in practice they didn't really do it. But this was kind of a moment of divergence, a moment where the Japanese practice ceased to meet with what the Americans sought for China. To the Japanese, of course, this was only fair. Manchuria was one of their great prizes from the Russo-Japanese War, a war that the Americans had, to them, undermined them in the settlement of. And here are American businessmen kind of, as seemingly as mercenarily, kind of seeking to invest in Manchuria in its aftermath, to reap some of the profits for themselves when the country itself is deeply in debt as a result of the conflict. Moreover, the Japanese would counter that, to them, Korea and Manchuria were the same as South America and the Caribbean were to the United States. How would the Americans, with their Monroe Doctrine, respond if the Japanese sought to establish a sphere of influence and invest in Latin America? So these questions of national honor and prestige, alongside these competing goals for China, have brought this warmer period of Japanese-American relations to an end by 1911, as the two saw themselves increasingly in conflict in East Asia, a full 30 years before the start of the Second World War. However, the final blow to the American-Japanese relationship would not actually be so much a rupture between the Japanese-Americans themselves as between the Japanese and the West writ large in 1920. So, in the First World War, the Japanese fought on the side of the Entente, of the Allies. Somewhat belatedly and doing it more or less purely to seize German colonies in the Pacific and the Liaodong Peninsula in China, but they fought on the winning side nonetheless. And so, at the Versailles Conference, Japan sought to not only get these acquisitions from Germany recognized, but to have their status as a first-rate power equal to the American and European states recognized in the Charter of the new League of Nations with a so-called racial equality clause. Now, lest you think this is entirely altruistic, this clause was meant to only apply to League members. The Japanese did consider themselves superior to their Korean and Chinese colonial subjects. But through this clause, which promised racial equality and forswore discrimination against other League members on the basis of race, the Japanese hoped to finally be more or less recognized on the world stage, to kind of prevent another situation like had arose in California with the discrimination and segregation of Japanese school children by the California government. But the proposition stalled at the conference amid fierce opposition from the British Commonwealth, particularly the Union of South Africa, which saw the clause as a potential death knell for its system of apartheid. Moreover, Japanese territorial ambitions in the Liaodong Peninsula in China had run afoul of some of the principles of the conference, of Wilson's 14 points, calling for national self-determination. Because in the aftermath of the war, the Chinese delegation was very interested in reclaiming this territory that had been held by the Germans. Meanwhile, an unrecognized Korean delegation very much wanted the Japanese out of Korea altogether. So American President Woodrow Wilson, of course one of the leading lights at the Versailles Conference, has these in his back pocket when he goes to negotiate with the Japanese. And desperately wanting both Japanese and British participation in the League, he's going to end up betraying his own 14 points and presenting the Japanese with a stark bargain. Drop your push for the racial equality clause. Join the League of Nations, and we'll let you keep your territorial gains in the Pacific. The Japanese essentially realized at this point that the issue was dead on arrival. And the failure of the Japanese delegation at Versailles to get the racial equality clause adopted is going to, yet again, prompt another round of rioting and unrest at home amid hopes that this would represent Japan's kind of coming-of-age moment on the world stage. Indeed, it was a very inauspicious beginning for the reign of the new Taisho emperor. But this is to say that despite all the advances the country had made since 1853, escaping the unequal treaties, defeating the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, fighting on the winning side of the First World War, European and American powers, the Japanese at least, still refused to see the Japanese as equals. In this regard, this also represents this culmination of a decade and a half of increasingly tense diplomacy between the United States and Japan in particular. The Japanese felt like they had become a great power in the aftermath of 1905, but that there was a general refusal to recognize this and to accord them kind of first-rate power status on account of race. Within the Japanese government itself, in which the military exerted a lot of influence, it was a final blow to those who preferred a more internationalist approach, who preferred to work with the international community rather than pursue imperial aims. Because indeed, the internationalist approach appeared to have gotten the Japanese basically nowhere in the last 15 years. And so increasingly, the militarist faction within government would enjoy more and more support among those in government and among the Japanese people in the aftermath of the First World War. And indeed, any hopes of kind of a restoration of a more internationalist approach to Japanese diplomacy, Japanese foreign policy, were dealt yet another hammer blow in 1930 with the beginning of the worldwide economic depression. In response to the depression before the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Hoover administration had raised the Hawley-Smoot tariff. For those of you familiar with American history, sometimes called the worst tariff in history, because it sought to kind of stabilize the American economy and to kind of stimulate domestic industry. But it did not do that, and indeed just kind of spread the depression worldwide as American trade partners no longer had access to one of their major export markets. And indeed, when this tariff goes into effect, a full 30% of Japanese exports go to the United States. If internationalism was already kind of in decline in the aftermath of 1920, the economic crisis furthers its descent even farther, as the crisis turns into a political crisis over what the direction for Japan will be. Over the course of 1931, in response to this, there are 3 abortive coup attempts by ultranationalists in the Japanese army seeking to eliminate internationalists in government. And while each would enjoy only limited success, the light punishments handed down by the courts in response to these coup attempts and the wide support among the populace for a more aggressive approach to foreign policy meant that they would keep happening. This 6-year period in Japanese history, by the way, between 31 and 36, is sometimes called the period of government by assassination, as the opponents of kind of imperial expansion and militarism abroad are increasingly forced out of government, if not outright killed, and the military assumes a larger and larger role, with 3 subsequent prime ministers being assassinated. And the increasing influence of this kind of militarist, more aggressive, more imperial-minded faction in the government would lead to a resumption of imperial attempts abroad, beginning with the invasion and formal annexation of Manchuria in 1931, and then finally the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and arguably the beginning of the Second World War in 1937, as the militarists finally consolidated their power over government. Isolated on the international scene, the focus became to build an autarkic, a self-sufficient East Asian co-prosperity sphere, which would place Japan at the forefront of an East Asian empire and end Western influence altogether in East Asia, especially China. Now, the Japanese government and populace generally viewed the war in China as necessary to ensure Japan's economic future, combined with language of Asia for the Asiatics, that their empire would actually give China a chance to modernize as opposed to the less development-minded Western empires. Now, in practice, the Japanese were, of course, no more benevolent imperial overlords than their Western predecessors. And their atrocities in China would draw widespread condemnation. But the Japanese, of course, viewed these complaints as hypocritical at best. And with the internationalist faction firmly out of power, the Japanese government sought to chart an independent path for the country in a skew attempting to work with Western powers that they perceived had betrayed the country in 1920. Now, the story here probably becomes a lot more familiar for those of you knowledgeable about American history. In response to Japanese actions in China and Indochina, the U.S. will levy an oil embargo on the country in July of 1941. And despite the autarkic aspirations of the Japanese government, the country at this point was still very much dependent on American oil imports to sustain its war effort in China. The Japanese, for all intents and purposes, viewed this action in July 1941 as tantamount to a declaration of war. The formal declaration of war was simply a kind of following through of this initial move. And so, in response to being cut off, military planners began looking for resources they secure access to, with the obvious option being securing the Dutch East Indies, the islands of Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and Timor, which had the added benefit of being Dutch, with the Netherlands being occupied by the Nazis, by Nazi Germany, an ally of Japan at this point. It would be so easy to take them and end the problem. However, astraddle the supply route from the Dutch East Indies to Japan was, of course, the American imperial holding of the Philippines. And planners doubted the United States would sit out a conflict of this nature in East Asia. And so war with the United States in the aftermath of July 1941 was viewed as inevitable. However, the Japanese leadership had a dim view of the ability of a democracy to sustain a war, and figured that simply delaying an effective American response for 6 months would be sufficient for them to acquire the territories they sought and then force a war-weary and demoralized America to the negotiating table. It had worked versus Russia in 1905. And so plans were drawn up to launch a surprise attack on the U.S. fleet as it lay at anchor in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And you can see clearly laid out here that there is a long chain of causation that led to the first bombs falling on the island of Oahu in 1941. Also, the role of faulty suppositions, because of course the Americans did not tire of war in 6 months. Even if that was a possibility in the first place, the surprise attack so enraged the American public that the moment Japan lost the Pacific War was the moment it began. Ironically, a more limited fight that had invited America to defend imperial holdings like the Philippines, a territory that a not unsubstantial number of American isolationists had little interest in maintaining, might have actually worked better for the Japanese. But besides this final wrong assumption, trapping themselves in a fatalistic decision to declare war against a host of nations simultaneously, it came at the end of a long chain of such forced decisions. To just recap briefly, why do we need to attack the U.S.? We need to attack the U.S. to secure access to the Dutch East Indies. Why do we need the Dutch East Indies and the resources therein? Because the U.S. is embargoing us. Why is the U.S. embargoing us? Because we're fighting in China. Why are we invading China? To create an East Asian empire. Why do we need an East Asian empire? To be independent and self-sufficient and chart an independent course. And why do we need to be self-sufficient? Because of a lack of recognition internationally and a failure of internationalist-minded diplomacy to attain the ends the Japanese government and populace sought. Let's say the final conflagration in the Pacific is at some level the Japanese were reacting to a frustrating series of provocations based on race and a lack of recognition of their great power status beginning in the period from 1905 to 1920. And even if that is not the case, it is perceived widely as such. And this perception is going to allow the more militarist factions in government to seize more power. Now, this is not to say that it was impossible to deviate from this course at later points, that by 1920 the Second World War in East Asia was completely inevitable. But by the dawn of the 1920s, with the failure of the Racial Equality Clause at Versailles, the steady losing ground of the internationalists in the government, with it being increasingly clear that the Japanese would never be perceived as fully equal on the international scene by Western powers, spearheaded by the U.S., it was more than likely. Now, of course, there are obvious limitations to a kind of Western action, Asian reaction mode of looking at history. But in adopting this view, in examining the trans-Pacific relationship between the United States and Japan from 1905 and 1920, and examining its broader view, examining it in the broader view of Japan's desire to be recognized on the world stage as a great power, these long-term causes, these long-term roots, the kind of deep history of the Pacific conflict become more apparent. And for what it's worth, the Americans clearly recognized this too in 1945. Thus, the presence of the Powhatan's flag on the Missouri. You tried, you failed, and we have fulfilled our promise to you made 92 years ago. The conflict that ended in nuclear fire beginning nearly a century earlier with the arrival of the black ships in Edo Bay. Thank you. All right, how much time do I have for questions? All right, 5. Cool. Oh, I'm so sorry, I did not see you. Go ahead.
Okay, so looking at modern events, relating back to the end of World War II, in the media it's been discussed situations regarding monuments erected in memoriam with comfort women, especially in place during this time period prior to Africa.
Yeah. I mean, Abe's government tries to kind of, has historically tried to kind of like, so do you know what, you ever heard of the Yasukuni Shrine? Okay, it's Japan, it's a shrine that honors all Japanese war dead, including those who died in the Second World War, doing, in many cases, horrible things, basically. As far as my own knowledge of American foreign policy, the United States just kind of tries to chart a course around it. The Japanese, of course, kind of try, represented by Abe's government, have tried to kind of have it both ways, if that makes sense. Like not overtly anger the Chinese and Koreans and being willing to admit fault at points, while still like we're still going to sneak in and visit the Yasukuni Shrine at 8 a.m. on one morning, basically. Let's say like one of my own like areas of interest is war memory, is this sort of history or this kind of contested past. And for me, at least one of the great questions of the 21st century is kind of, especially in comparison to Germany in the aftermath of the Second World War, kind of seeing how Japan kind of grapples with this national legacy. Because there is kind of, you know, you should be able to celebrate, like the average Japanese soldier in the Second World War is fighting for the homeland. They're fighting to protect their friends and family. But how can you rectify that with everything else, basically? Maybe there's a way, but it is difficult to suss out, to say the least. Did I more or less answer your question? Or do you have a follow-up? Sorry, what? Okay. In the back.
So if Japan had acquired the oil from the Dutch Indies, do you think that would have changed the outcome of the war?
The war in the Pacific was well, they did acquire it ultimately. It's why they're going to base their navy out of Borneo, basically from 1943 onwards, because where the oil is, and they can't actually get the oil back to Japan because of the actions of American submarines. I mean, Japan never had a chance to win the Pacific War, never for a moment. And indeed, the Axis powers in World War II never really had a chance. Germany maybe for like one brief moment, but then Hitler decides to invade Russia, and that Russia could have won that war all on its own. It didn't need American help. But the Japanese, there's no way. Just period. They kind of trapped themselves into this series of we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this. And constructing these very elegant plans, these very elegant ways of executing their aims, but completely disconnected from what was actually achievable kind of in the war itself. Other questions? Oh, I'm so sorry. What's up? There were, notably Portuguese Jesuits have been very active in Japan during the period of Sengoku Jidai, during the 16th century. There were a large population of Japanese Christians at this point. In the aftermath of Sengoku, there's going to be a rebellion by Christians in Japan that the shogun is going to brutally put down, which will basically eliminate Christianity in Japan, not entirely, because you can't stamp out religion entirely, but for all intents and purposes. And the Dutch, in comparison to the Portuguese, they're just happy to trade. They're not really interested in spreading the word of God. So that's why the Japanese are ultimately going to allow them to remain and trade in this limited way. Any other questions?